Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your chosen material and distill the key concepts, giving you a comprehensive understanding without all the information overload. So today's focus comes from a really crucial section of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. We're looking at his thoughts on what he calls the great sin. And this material, it really asks us to reconsider, well, everything we think we know about moral failings, to sort of identify the one vice Lewis sees as the essential evil.
It's powerful source material, for
Yeah.
sure. Because Lewis he immediately throws out the usual list of bad things. He shifts the focus away from the sins we can see easily, the ones tied to appetite or physical things, and he puts a spotlight on something much more internal, much more structural, and because of that, much more deadly. So I think our mission for this deep dive is to really get a handle on why this specific vice is so destructive. We need to figure out how it's different from other faults and maybe, most critically, why it's so hard to spot it in ourselves.
Right, that part is what he hits on first. The fact that it's the one thing everyone loathes in other people, but that almost no one outside of a Christian context ever thinks they have.
Not at all. I mean, think about it. People will admit to being bad-tempered. They'll say, oh, I have a short fuse, or, I struggle with this or that appetite. But you almost never hear someone say, my biggest problem is that I'm just incredibly proud. There's this perfect camouflage it has.
It's a strange blind spot, isn't it? So we're dealing with an internal condition that resists its own diagnosis. Lewis, of course, calls this vice pride or self-conceit, and its opposite virtue is humility. But the scale of what he's claiming here it's huge. He's not just saying it's one of the 7 deadly sins. He's saying it sits at the absolute center of Christian morality.
Right. Yes, the mother sin, as you might call it. And that's where the thinking gets really vital, because what Lewis is saying is if you manage to control your lust or your greed or your anger, but you don't deal with pride, well, then you haven't really done anything of spiritual value. The root is still there, just waiting to sprout in new ways.
Okay, so let's get right into that, because this is where his language can be, well, a little shocking. He says flat out that things like unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, they're flea bites in comparison to pride. Why such a stark comparison? I mean, some of those sins cause immense visible damage. How can he call them flea bites?
It's a rhetorical shock, I think. He's trying to get us to completely reorient our moral compass. He's not saying the damage they cause is small. What he's arguing is that those sins operate on, let's say, the surface of our lives.
Yeah.
They often come from our animal nature, misdirected desires, a loss of control. They could ruin your life, absolutely. But they don't necessarily attack the very core orientation of your soul toward God.
Ah, so it's a matter of origin. Sins of the body are a failure to manage the created world, but pride is a failure to acknowledge the Creator himself.
Precisely. That's why pride is the essential vice. For Lewis, it's the original sin itself. He states it so clearly. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. So he's positioning pride as the first act of cosmic mutiny, the choice to put the self at the center of reality where God should be.
And if you look at it that way, as spiritual rebellion, then it makes sense why he'd call it the complete anti-God state of mind. Rebellion is, well, it's a total rejection of authority.
It's more than just rejection. It's an attempt at replacement. Lewis argues that pride is purely spiritual. It comes, he says, direct from hell. Think about it this way. Someone who struggles with gluttony is at least acknowledging a need for something outside of themselves, the food, the sensation. The desire is corrupted, sure, but it's not entirely self-generated. Pride, on the other hand, needs nothing outside the self. It's a self-contained arrogance. It's the desire to be independent of God, to owe him nothing.
Which makes it so much more subtle and more deadly. Because our usual defenses like self-control or discipline, they might not work against it. They could even become tools of pride.
And that is such a critical point. If you stop drinking because of self-respect, Lewis would say you've just swapped one master for another. You've fed your pride. And this creates what he calls the chain reaction. Once that desire to be superior is in charge, every other action, even good ones, gets filtered through it. It produces jealousy, hatred, all the rest.
So the spiritual failure comes first, and it causes the moral failure. Okay, so if we all have this huge blind spot, how on earth do we begin to figure out how proud we are? Lewis gives us a really practical test for it, doesn't he? An external test for an internal problem.
He does. It's what you could call the snub test. He tells us to ask ourselves, how much do I dislike it when other people snub me or refuse to take any notice of me or patronize me or show off? Our reaction when we feel ignored or diminished. Lewis says that's the most accurate gauge of our own self-conceit.
Okay, let's unpack that reaction. Why do we feel that surge of anger when someone else gets the attention we wanted? What's happening there?
It's because, as Lewis puts it, each person's pride is in competition with everyone else's pride. You're annoyed that someone else is the big noise because you want it to be. You feel a loss of status. And status is the currency that pride deals in. If you genuinely didn't care about being the smartest or most important person in the room, a snub wouldn't even register.
So this is what separates pride from everything else, this competitive core. He says it's competitive by its very nature. It's not that it sometimes causes competition.
It is competition. That's the foundational piece. Pride gets no pleasure from just having something. It only gets pleasure from having more of it than the next person. If you have a beautiful house, pride doesn't care about the architecture. It cares that your house is bigger or nicer than your neighbor's.
So the thing itself, the house, the talent, the money, it's almost beside the point. The pleasure is in the gap, in being above the rest.
Yes, he makes it so clear. If everyone on earth were suddenly made equal in wealth, looks, and talent, the proud person would have absolutely nothing left to be proud about. The game would be over.
Wow. So once competition is gone, pride is gone.
That's it.
Yeah.
This constant, restless need for superiority is what makes it so different and what makes it so destructive. So building on that, Lewis then draws this really clear line in the sand between pride and the other vices. He says other faults are competitive only by accident. And this difference in their basic structure is why he calls them flea bites. They might lead to conflict sometimes, but that's not their main purpose.
Let's use his examples because they really make it clear. The comparison between lust and pride really isolates what's going on.
Okay, so take lust. The sexual impulse might make two men compete, but only if they both happen to want the same person. It's accidental. They could just as easily desire two different people, and there would be no competition at all.
Their focus is on the object of desire.
Right. But the proud man, he operates on a totally different level. He might steal someone's partner just to prove he's the better man. The partner in that case isn't really a person to him.
She's a trophy, a way to win.
Exactly. The pleasure isn't in the relationship. It's in the act of winning the rivalry. The competition is the whole point.
That reframes so many conflicts, doesn't it? From office politics to relationships. It suggests we're often not fighting over the thing itself, but over the status that comes with winning the thing.
And he applies the same logic to wealth. He contrasts greed and pride. Greed, in its simple form, just wants money for stuff. Better food, a nicer house, more comfort.
But there's a limit to that, right? Lewis uses the example of a man earning, say, 10,000 pounds a year back then. That was enough for every possible luxury.
So greed should be satisfied at that point. The appetite for pleasure is full. The question is, what makes that man push to earn 20,000 or 100,000?
It can't be for more pleasure. He already has all that.
No, it's pride. The true enjoyment now comes from the wish for control, for status. The desire is to be richer than that other rich man. It's about power and influence.
The goal shifts from satisfying the body to dominating other people. That image he uses of wanting to move others about like toy soldiers, that's chilling.
And it applies to everything, not just money. The intellectual who has to make everyone else feel stupid, the person who must win every single argument. The driving force is always the desire for control and superiority.
And because it's always competitive, it can never rest. The moment you're number one, you're just afraid of who's at number two. There's always a rival.
Which leads him to a devastating conclusion. So many of the evils we blame on greed or selfishness are actually at their root caused by pride, because greed can, in theory, be satisfied. Pride cannot.
Which means pride is, by its very nature, a source of misery and division, far more than the simpler vices.
Absolutely. Pride always means enmity. He says it is enmity. Other vices, like drunkenness, can sometimes even lead to a kind of dark fellowship. People bond over their shared weakness. But pride ensures conflict. It guarantees it because it demands a hierarchy where you have to be on top. It creates isolation.
And most importantly, it's not just enmity between people. It creates enmity toward God. This is why it's the essential vice for Lewis.
This is the theological core. Lewis argues that when you come before God, you encounter something that is, in every way, immeasurably superior to yourself. God is the ultimate, undeniable competitor to the proud self. The very existence of God demands that you give up your claim to be self-sufficient.
So a proud person literally cannot know God. Because knowing God requires looking up, acknowledging your dependence, but the proud person is always looking down.
Right, they're looking down on things, on people to judge and compare, and you can't see something that is above you if you are always looking down. It's a structural impossibility.
Your whole spiritual posture is wrong. The very first step of faith surrender submission is the one thing a proud person refuses to do.
The great irony, then, is that the person who wants to be seen as the ultimate success, the one who is self-made, is the one person who is incapable of meeting the actual source of all reality and goodness. Pride locks you out.
Okay, that inability to look up raises a really difficult and frankly a very uncomfortable question that Lewis tackles. How is it that we see people who are obviously consumed by pride, arrogant, self-righteous, who also claim to be deeply religious? If pride blocks God, how do they square that circle?
Lewis's answer is, it's stark. He says they are worshiping an imaginary God. They've constructed a God, maybe not even consciously, who exists to confirm their own superiority. They're using religion not to submit to a creator, but to get leverage over other created
It
beings.
sounds like a kind of spiritual transaction,
Right.
a deal.
It's a tragic trade-off. He says they pay, what is it, a penny worth of imaginary humility to this phantom God. They might say, oh, I am nothing before God. But in return, they get a pound's worth of pride towards their fellow men. They imagine this God approves of them, thinks they're special, and ranks them higher than all the ordinary people.
So their religion becomes just another tool for creating status, a way to feel superior.
Yes. And Lewis gives us a really sharp way to test this in ourselves. Anytime we find our religious life making us feel good about ourselves, and especially making us feel that we are better or smarter than someone else, we can be certain that we're dealing with pride, not God.
Because true contact with God diminishes the self. It doesn't inflate it.
The real test of being in God's presence, he says, is one of two things. Either you forget about yourself entirely because you're so caught up in his glory, or you see yourself for what you are, a small, dirty object in comparison to his perfection. And Lewis actually prefers the first one, forgetting yourself altogether.
It's a scary thought that the worst of all vices can sneak right into the center of our religious life. But then he takes it a step further. He says the devil can actually use pride to cure us of the simpler vices.
This is the spiritual cancer analogy. It's just devastatingly accurate. A man might overcome, say, cowardice, not out of love for God, but by appealing to his dignity, to his self-respect.
He thinks I'm too good for that sort of behavior. It's beneath me.
And Lewis says the devil just laughs.
Yeah.
He is perfectly happy to see someone become outwardly moral and self-controlled, as long as, in the process, he is setting up the dictatorship of pride inside that person's soul. He's happy to trade a few behavioral sins for the total corruption of the person's spiritual orientation. The man becomes a respectable shell, but his internal engine is now pure self-glorification.
And that pride, that cancer, eats up the very possibility of love or contentment or even common sense. Love requires seeing value in others. Pride only sees them as a measuring stick. Contentment requires rest. Pride demands endless striving.
So, given how subtle and destructive this is, we have to be really careful. Lewis points out 4 common misunderstandings about all this that we should probably walk through.
Okay, let's take them one by one. The first one is about enjoying praise versus being proud. Where's the line? This is a big one for anyone who does anything public or creative.
Right. Lewis is clear that simply enjoying praise is not pride. Not if your pleasure comes from having pleased someone you rightly wanted to please, a child getting a pat on the back, or, hearing, well done, good and faithful servant. The pleasure there is in the connection, in the success of the act. It's focused outward.
So when does it become a problem? When does it cross the line into pride?
The second your focus shifts inward, you go from thinking, oh good, he liked it, to thinking, what a fine person I must be to have done that.
The delight is no longer in the praise giver or the work, but in yourself. That's the danger zone.
Which leads into his point about vanity. He calls vanity the least bad kind of pride, which seems backward. Why would constantly needing applause be less dangerous? It's a brilliant insight into human psychology. The vain person who is always angling for compliments, at least still values other people enough to want their approval. They are still, in a way, dependent on the community. They're still human.
They haven't become totally self-sufficient.
Exactly. The real, what he calls diabolical pride, is when a person gets to a point where they look down on others so much they don't care what anyone thinks. They achieved a kind of spiritual independence. They dismiss the rabble. They say they only act to satisfy their own ideals, their own conscience. They've become a law unto themselves.
And that's why he says it's better the frying pan than the fire. Don't use that kind of deep pride to cure simple vanity.
Right. You'd be trading a shallow problem for a much, much deeper one.
Okay, the second misunderstanding, being proud of someone else. like your son or your family.
Lewis says that most of the time, this phrase just means I have a warm-hearted admiration for them. And admiration for something outside yourself is not a sin. It's a good thing.
The problem comes when you use their accomplishments to make yourself feel superior.
Yes. When you start giving yourself airs because of your famous relative. But even then, Lewis says it's a lesser fault than being proud just of yourself.
Why is that?
Because loving or admiring anything at all outside of yourself is one step away from total spiritual ruin. Your focus is at least partially outward, not completely locked on the shrine of your own ego. Okay, that brings us to the third misunderstanding, and this one is key for the theology of it all. Why does God demand humility in the first place?
A lot of people see it as God being offended, like a king whose dignity has been slighted.
Right, as if God himself were proud. Lewis says that's just us projecting our own pride onto God. God is not worried about his dignity. The true goal is for our sake, not his. God wants us to know him. He wants to give us himself. And since he is reality itself and we are, well, we're not, any genuine contact with him will automatically produce humility. It's a consequence, not a rule.
So humility isn't a burden to carry. It's what happens naturally when we stop believing our own hype, when we see reality clearly.
And it's meant to be an infinite relief, a comfort. Lewis argues that we spend our lives being restless and anxious, trying to prop up this silly, fragile dignity we've invented for ourselves.
And that is exhausting. Always competing, always comparing.
It's the burden of maintaining a false self. Lewis pictures God as trying to help us take off this silly, ugly, fancy dress we're all strutting around in. Getting rid of that false self, he says, is like a drink of cold water to a man in a desert. Humility is freedom from the job of being your own God.
That's a powerful way to look at it. It completely flips the idea of humility as weakness.
And that leads right into the fourth misunderstanding. What a truly humble person actually looks like.
Right. It's not the smarmy, greasy person who is always saying, oh, I'm nobody.
No, that's often just pride fishing for compliments. It's still all about them. Lewis says the genuinely humble person probably won't be thinking about humility at all. He'll just seem like a cheerful, intelligent person who takes a real interest in what you have to say. He's not thinking about himself. His focus is outward.
And if you happen to dislike him, Lewis suggests it might be because you envy how easily he enjoys life, free from that constant need to compete.
So we've established how insidious pride is and how it's basically invisible to the person who has it. Where do we even start? How do you begin to acquire humility? Lewis gives a very clear, very simple first step.
The first step is just to realize that one is proud. He calls it a biggish step, and he says nothing can be done before it. You have to admit you have the disease before you can seek the cure.
And then he ends with that perfect paradoxical warning that brings it all back to the start. He says, if you think you are not conceited, it means you are very conceited indeed. And facing that paradox, I think, is where the journey has to begin. Realizing just how far gone we are is the first painful step toward freedom.
So we've really unpacked Lewis's argument that pride is the essential evil, that it's competitive by its very nature and the source of our enmity with each other and with God. We've seen why he considers other sins flea bites in comparison, and also the relief that true humility is supposed to bring, liberation from the endless job of self-promotion.
What's so arresting about it is the total reframing of the moral life. It calls us to not just watch our behavior, but to constantly audit the deep spiritual orientation of our hearts, that core resistance to God that keeps us from seeing reality because we're too busy looking down.
And that idea that our own sense of goodness might just be the camouflage for our deepest sin, that's the real challenge here. We appreciate you sending us this material for today's deep dive.
So this raises a final question for you, the listener, to think about. If Lewis is right that pride works primarily through comparison, and our modern world, especially with social media, is a non-stop engine of comparison. Comparing our looks, our wealth, our success, even our curated virtue against millions of others. Does all that external pressure make this first essential step of humility even harder today than it was when Lewis wrote these words?
That is certainly something to grapple with. Join us next time for another deep dive.